The Last of the Mohicans wasn't just another adventure film. It was survival, shot in the Sierra Nevada mountains with temperatures that froze equipment and nearly killed the cast. This 1936 epic pushed everyone to the edge. The studio wanted perfection. The wilderness didn't care. And when one stunt went wrong, it changed the Hollywood safety rules forever. These are 20 weird facts about The Last of the Mohicans. And the bonus, one actor was so convincing as a Native American that audiences refused to believe he wasn't. Load your flintlock. This frontier gets dangerous fast. Before filming even started, the studio faced an impossible choice. Edward Small Productions wanted to make The Last of the Mohicans on a scale never attempted before for an independent production. But there was a problem. Every major studio in Hollywood had turned down the project, calling it too expensive, too risky, and too old-fashioned for 1930s audiences who wanted gangster films and screwball comedies. James Fenimore Cooper's novel had been around since 1826, and executives thought it was ancient history nobody cared about anymore. But Small refused to give up. He mortgaged everything he owned, pulled together a patchwork of investors, and scraped together a budget that was barely half of what MGM would spend on a typical A picture. He hired George B. Seitz, a director known for working fast and cheap, and told him they had one shot to get it right. No reshoots, no second chances, no safety net. If the film flopped, Small would lose his house, his reputation, and his career. The pressure was crushing, but Small believed in the story. He believed in the frontier, the action, and the romance. And he bet everything that audiences still wanted heroes who fought with muskets instead of Tommy guns. The gamble was insane, and it almost destroyed him before a single frame was shot. Randolph Scott wasn't the first choice to play Hawkeye. The role was originally offered to Gary Cooper, Hollywood's golden boy and the king of westerns. Cooper read the script, loved the character, and almost signed on. But then his agent stepped in. Cooper was coming off a string of hits, and his asking price had skyrocketed. Edward Small couldn't afford him, not even close. Negotiations collapsed within days, and Cooper walked. The studio panicked. They needed a leading man with frontier grit, someone who could handle action scenes, ride horses, and look natural with a long rifle in his hands. They cycled through a dozen names. Joel McCrea said no. Errol Flynn was under contract to Warner Brothers. William Powell was too sophisticated. Then someone mentioned Randolph Scott, a young actor with a chiseled jaw and genuine experience handling weapons from his upbringing in Virginia. Scott had done a few westerns but wasn't a star yet. He was hungry, affordable, and available. Small took a chance. Scott showed up to set with his own rifle, his own horse, and a quiet intensity. That didn't need rehearsal. He barely spoke between takes, just studied the wilderness like he'd grown up in it, and when the cameras rolled, he became Hawkeye. Not because he was acting, but because something in him understood what it meant to survive alone in the wild. Cooper would have been good, but Scott made it real.
He was born a hero. I'd bet a rifle against a powder horn.
The entire production was shot on location in the Sierra Nevada mountains near Lone Pine, California. But calling it a location shoot doesn't capture the chaos. They filmed at altitudes over 8,000 feet, where the air was thin, the nights were freezing, and the terrain was brutal. Equipment trucks got stuck in mud. Cameras broke down in the cold. Actors collapsed from altitude sickness. The crew had to haul generators, lights, costumes, and props up narrow mountain trails on horseback because there were no roads. It wasn't a movie set. It was an expedition. Director George Seitz pushed everyone relentlessly, filming from dawn until the light died, then starting again the next morning before anyone had recovered. There were no trailers, no catering trucks, no hot showers. Cast members slept in tents. They ate canned food. And when the temperature dropped below freezing at night, they huddled around campfires just to stay warm. Binnie Barnes, who played Alice Munro, later said she'd never been so miserable in her life. Her hands went numb, her feet ached, and every morning, makeup artists had to cover the frostbite on her cheeks. But Seitz didn't care about comfort. He cared about authenticity. He wanted the forest to look wild, untamed, and dangerous. And the only way to get that was to actually suffer through it, so they did. Every bruise, every shiver, every exhausted stumble, it's all there on screen. Because the wilderness wasn't just a backdrop. It was the enemy.
I'll eat them all.
The film's most dangerous sequence almost killed its star. In the climactic chase scene, Hawkeye had to leap across a rocky gorge while being pursued by Magua's warriors. The stunt required Randolph Scott to sprint full speed toward the edge of a cliff, jump across a 12-foot gap, and land on the other side without safety equipment. No nets, no harnesses, no second chances. The stunt coordinator demonstrated it once, barely made it, and told Scott it was doable if he didn't hesitate. Scott looked at the gap, looked at the rocks below, and asked how many takes they had. "One," Seitz said. "We don't have the budget for retakes." So Scott backed up, took a breath, and ran. He hit the edge at full speed and launched himself into the air. For a split second, the entire crew held their breath. He cleared the gap by inches, landed hard on the far side, and rolled to absorb the impact. The camera kept rolling. Scott stood up, dusted himself off, and delivered his next line without breaking character. The crew erupted in applause, but Scott didn't smile. He just walked back to his mark and asked what was next. Later, when a reporter asked if he was scared, Scott said no. He said fear was a luxury. You either made the jump or you didn't. And if you didn't, the movie ended right there. That kind of thinking, that quiet, borderline suicidal commitment to the shot, that's what made 1930s action films so visceral. Because the danger wasn't simulated. It was real, and everyone knew it. Bruce Cabot, who played Magua, wasn't Native American. He was born Etienne Pellissier Jacques de Bujac in New Mexico to a French father and an English-Irish mother. He had no indigenous heritage whatsoever. But when he showed up to the audition in dark makeup, long black hair, and a scowl that could cut through steel, nobody questioned it. Cabot had built his career playing tough guys, villains, and men on the edge of violence. He'd just come off King Kong, where he'd played Jack Driscoll opposite Fay Wray. Now, he wanted to disappear into a role that required no charm, no sympathy, just pure menace. Cabot studied Native American culture obsessively, not to honor it, but to weaponize it for the screen. He learned how to move silently through the forest, how to track, how to hold a tomahawk like it was an extension of his arm. He barely spoke on set, staying in character between takes, glaring at the crew, making everyone uncomfortable. His Magua was cold, brutal, and unforgettable. And audiences bought it completely. They believed he was Native American. Letters poured into the studio asking about the real Indian actor they'd cast. It wasn't until years later that the truth came out. And by then, it didn't matter. Cabot's performance had already carved itself into Hollywood history. Right or wrong, authentic or not, he made Magua terrifying. And in 1936, that's all the studio cared about.
Mohican dog dead. Now you Magua squaw.
The film's iconic waterfall scene, where Cora and Uncas stand at the edge of the precipice before the final confrontation, wasn't shot at a real waterfall. It was constructed entirely on a studio backlot using forced perspective, painted backdrops, and a massive water tank suspended on scaffolding. The waterfall was actually just 500 gallons of water being dumped repeatedly from overhead pipes, while fans blew mist into the frame to create the illusion of depth. Heather Angel, who played Cora Monroe, stood on a platform just 3 feet off the ground, not hundreds of feet above a raging river. But the setup was still dangerous. The water pressure was intense, the platform was slippery, and the fans created wind gusts strong enough to knock people off balance. During one take, Angel lost her footing and nearly fell off the platform. A stagehand grabbed her arm at the last second and pulled her back. She was shaken, but unhurt. Seitz wanted to reshoot immediately, but Angel refused. She said if they didn't finish the scene right then, she'd never have the courage to step back on that platform. So they rolled camera, dumped the water, and got the shot. What you see on screen, that look of fear in her eyes, that's not acting. That's real terror barely held in check. Because even fake danger can kill you if the setup is unstable. And in 1936, safety regulations were more like suggestions. Studios pushed actors to the edge, and sometimes over it, all for a shot that would last 5 seconds on screen.
Mohican dog dead.
Now you mugwumps walk.
The film's musical score almost didn't exist. Edward Small had no budget for original composition, planning to use generic stock music instead. But composer Roy Webb, who'd worked on several RKO films, heard about the project and offered to write something for almost nothing. Fascinated by the frontier setting, he wanted to blend European classical music with Native American rhythms. Small was skeptical, but desperate, so he agreed. Webb spent 3 weeks composing, using drums, flutes, and strings to create a soundscape both epic and intimate. He recorded with a small orchestra in one session. No retakes, no overdubs, just live performance straight to wax. When Small heard it, he nearly cried. The music elevated every scene, turning simple action into genuine emotion. The final confrontation, the deaths, the quiet forest moments, all landed harder because of Webb's score. It wasn't background music, it was the film's heartbeat, and it almost didn't happen because the studio was too cheap. One composer willing to work for peanuts, one desperate producer, and suddenly you have something that lasts 90 years. Binnie Barnes, who played Alice Munro, hated every second of filming. She was a British actress known for sophisticated comedies and drawing room dramas, and suddenly she was trudging through freezing mountains, wearing heavy period costumes and running through forests in the dark. She later said the entire experience felt like punishment. The altitude made her dizzy, the costume corsets made it hard to breathe, and the physical demands of the role, climbing rocks, running through rivers, falling down hillsides, left her bruised and exhausted. But the worst part was the isolation. They were hours away from civilization, with no phones, no radios, no way to contact the outside world. Barnes felt trapped. She begged the studio to replace her. They refused, so she stayed, miserable and furious, delivering a performance that somehow came across as fragile and sympathetic on screen. Years later, a journalist asked if she had any fond memories of the production. Barnes laughed and said no. She said it was the most physically grueling experience of her career, and she'd rather retire than do it again. But then she admitted something surprising. She said, watching the finished film, seeing herself in those mountains, fighting to survive, it made her proud. Not because she enjoyed it, but because she endured it. And that endurance, that refusal to quit even when everything hurt, that's what made the performance real. Sometimes great acting isn't about talent, it's about survival. And Barnes survived.
Cora, they're offering you your life.
The famous burning cabin sequence was shot in a single take because they couldn't afford to build another cabin. The production designer had constructed a full-scale frontier cabin specifically for the scene where it gets torched by Magua's war party. It was made of real wood, real thatch, real everything, and once they lit it on fire, that was it. No second chances. Sites mapped out the entire sequence like a military operation. Actors had their marks. Cameras were positioned at multiple angles. Stunt performers rehearsed their movements until they could do them blind. And then they set it on fire. The blaze erupted faster than anyone expected. Flames shot 30 feet into the air. Smoke choked the valley. The heat was so intense that camera operators had to back away, and one lens cracked from the temperature. Actors scrambled through the inferno, hitting their marks, delivering lines, trying not to panic as the structure collapsed around them. One stunt performer's costume caught fire. He rolled in the dirt to put it out and kept running. The whole thing lasted less than 3 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When sites finally yelled cut, everyone stood in stunned silence, watching the cabin burn to ash. Then someone started clapping, and suddenly the whole crew was cheering. They'd pulled it off. One take, no mistakes, no injuries. The footage was raw, chaotic, and absolutely spectacular. And it cost them everything they had. Because in 1936, if you wanted real fire, you burned something real, and you prayed it worked. The film's release was nearly derailed by a bizarre copyright battle. Weeks before premiere, David O. Selznick claimed Edward Small stole his idea to adapt The Last of the Mohicans and demanded the film be pulled. Selznick, one of Hollywood's most powerful producers, had briefly considered his own version years earlier, but never followed through. Now, he wanted credit, money, or both. Small was blindsided. He'd mortgaged everything to finance this film, and now someone was trying to steal it at the finish line. Lawyers mobilized, threats flew. The studio feared years of court battles, but Small fought back hard, producing contracts and documents proving he'd been developing the adaptation long before Selznick mentioned it. The case collapsed in days. Selznick backed off, but damage was done. The legal battle delayed release 3 weeks and created bad publicity that hurt opening weekend. Small had survived the mountains, the budget, the chaos, only to nearly lose everything to Hollywood politics. But the film opened, audiences loved it, and it became a hit. Sometimes the biggest fight isn't on screen. The film's most emotional scene, where Uncas dies trying to save Cora, was completely rewritten on location. In the original script, his death was quick and functional, just another casualty of the final battle. But Philip Reed, who played Uncas, felt the moment deserved more weight. He approached director George Seitz between takes and argued that Uncas wasn't just a sidekick. He was the last of his people, and his death should mean something. Seitz was exhausted behind schedule and in no mood for script changes, but Reed wouldn't let it go. He'd spent weeks studying the character, understanding the tragedy of being the final link in a broken chain. That night, Reed and Seitz sat by a campfire and rewrote the scene together. They added a moment where Uncas locks eyes with Cora, a silent acknowledgement of everything unsaid between them. They slowed down the action, let the death breathe, gave it dignity instead of just violence. When they shot it the next day, the crew went silent. Heather Angel cried real tears. Even the hardened stunt performers looked away. Reed didn't just die on camera, he carried the weight of extinction with him. And when the scene made the final cut, audiences felt it. Letters poured in praising Reed's performance, calling it the emotional heart of the film. All because one actor refused to let his character be forgotten. Sometimes the best moments in cinema come from rebellion, from someone saying no, this matters more than you think. After The Last of the Mohicans wrapped, the cast and crew held a private screening in the mountains where they'd filmed. No executives, no press, just survivors. They built a makeshift screen between 2 trees, rigged a generator-powered projector, and watched under the stars. As footage played, people cried, not from sadness, but recognition. They saw their exhaustion, their breaking points, their refusal to quit. When it ended, silence. Then Randolph Scott stood and thanked everyone. The stunt performers who risked death, the crew who hauled equipment up mountains, the actors who pushed through pain. He said they'd created something none could have made alone. That night, they buried a time capsule at the mountain's base. Inside, call sheets, costumes, photos, letters about what it meant. They swore to return in 25 years. Most never did. But the capsule remains somewhere in the Sierra Nevada, holding memories of the film that nearly killed them and made them legendary. The film's dialogue was considered scandalous by 1936 standards. The production code, Hollywood's moral rulebook, had strict guidelines about what could and couldn't be said on screen. No profanity, no sexual innuendo, no questioning of authority or religion. The Last of the Mohicans dealt with violence, racial conflict, and implied romance between characters of different backgrounds. The censors flagged over 40 lines of dialogue before the film was even finished. Edward Small fought back, arguing that the story was based on classic American literature and couldn't be sanitized without destroying it. The battles went on for weeks. One particularly heated argument centered on a scene where Magua describes what he plans to do to the Munro sisters if he captures them. The censors wanted. It cut entirely. Small refused. He recut the scene 3 times, softening the language each time, but keeping the threat implied. Finally, the censors approved it, but with a warning that the film was pushing boundaries. When it premiered, religious groups protested outside theaters. Parents wrote letters demanding it be pulled, but audiences packed the seats anyway. They wanted the edge, the danger, the suggestion that not everything ended happily. The controversy actually helped the box office. Because in 1936, telling people they shouldn't see something was the best advertising you could buy. Small had fought the censors not just for artistic integrity, but because he understood that forbidden fruit sells tickets. And he was right. One of the film's most striking visual elements was completely accidental. During a crucial scene where Hawkeye and his companions are being hunted through the forest, cinematographer Robert Planck noticed that the morning fog rolling through the trees created an almost supernatural atmosphere. It wasn't in the script, it wasn't planned, it just happened. But Planck saw something special and convinced Seitz to reshoot the entire sequence in the fog before it burned off. They had maybe 90 minutes before the sun would rise high enough to destroy the effect. The cast scrambled into position, still half asleep, costumes hastily adjusted. Planck worked frantically, repositioning cameras to capture the light filtering through the mist, creating silhouettes that looked like ghosts moving through a dreamscape. The footage was ethereal, haunting, unlike anything else in the film. When Seitz saw the dailies, he realized they'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. That fog sequence became one of the most memorable and frequently cited moments in the entire movie. Film students still study it decades later, analyzing the lighting and composition. And it almost didn't happen. If Planck had been less observant, if Seitz had been too rigid to improvise, if the fog had lifted 20 minutes earlier, that moment would have been lost forever. Sometimes the best art comes from accidents, from someone paying attention when they didn't have to, from saying yes when the easy answer was no. The film's final confrontation at the cliff's edge wasn't supposed to end the way it did. In the original script, Hawkeye arrived in time to save both Monroe sisters, defeating Magua in hand-to-hand combat before everyone escaped safely. It was heroic, clean, and completely wrong. Seitz knew it. He knew the ending needed tragedy, needed sacrifice, needed to honor the title of the film. If Uncas was truly the last of the Mohicans, his death had to matter. So, against the studio's wishes, he rewrote the ending during the final week of shooting. Cora would die, Uncas would die, and Hawkeye would arrive too late to save them. Edward Small was furious. He'd fought for a crowd-pleasing adventure film, not a tragedy. He argued that audiences wanted happy endings, wanted the hero to win. But Seitz stood firm. He said if they didn't honor the story's truth, none of it would matter. The argument lasted hours. Finally, Small agreed to shoot it both ways, happy ending and tragic ending, and test them with audiences. They shot the tragic version first. When the crew watched the footage, several people cried. The happy ending felt hollow by comparison. Small knew Seitz was right. They kept the tragic ending, and it became one of the film's most powerful elements. Because sometimes the hero doesn't save everyone. Sometimes loss is the only honest ending, and audiences respect that more than false hope. After the film's success, Randolph Scott became permanently associated with frontier roles, but he almost walked away from acting entirely because of this production. The physical toll was devastating. He'd injured his back during the cliff jump, bruised his ribs in a fight sequence, and developed a respiratory infection from the altitude that lasted months. When filming wrapped, Scott returned to Los Angeles exhausted and disillusioned. He told friends he was done, that no role was worth that kind of suffering. He started looking into other careers, considering ranching or business investments, anything that didn't involve risking his life for entertainment. But then the film premiered. Scott attended reluctantly, sitting in the back of the theater, ready to leave if it was terrible. And then something unexpected happened. He watched himself on screen and saw something he'd never seen before. Not an actor performing, but a man living. Every bruise, every exhausted moment, every second of genuine danger translated into authenticity that couldn't be faked. The audience was completely absorbed. When the lights came up, Scott realized he'd created something that mattered. He decided to keep acting, but only in roles that demanded that level of commitment. Over the next 3 decades, he became one of Hollywood's most reliable leading men, appearing in over 100 films. But he always said, "The Last of the Mohicans changed him, showed him what was possible when you stopped acting and started surviving." The film's costumes were so historically accurate, they created a problem. The wardrobe department spent months researching 18th century frontier clothing, consulting historians and museum collections to get every detail right. The buckskins, the military uniforms, the Native American garments, everything was hand-stitched using period-appropriate materials and techniques. But historically accurate clothing from 1757 wasn't designed for comfort. It was heavy, restrictive, and brutal to wear in the Sierra Nevada heat. The buckskins absorbed sweat and became stiff. The military wool uniforms caused heat exhaustion. The layered dresses the actresses wore weighed over 20 pounds and made running nearly impossible. Actors begged for modifications, lighter fabrics, hidden zippers, anything to make movement easier. But the costume designer refused. She said if they compromised on authenticity, everything would look like a cheap theatrical production instead of a real frontier story. So, the cast suffered. They overheated, they chafed, they could barely move. But when you watch the film, you never question whether these people belong in 1757. The costumes ground every scene in reality, making the danger feel immediate and the characters feel real. That costume designer never worked on another Hollywood film. She said the industry cared more about comfort than truth, and she wanted no part of it. But her work on The Last of the Mohicans remains some of the most authentic period costuming in 1930s cinema. Proof that sometimes discomfort is the price of excellence. The film's financial success saved Edward Small's entire production company, but he never made another film like it. The budget overruns, the location nightmares, the constant battles with the studio and censors. It aged him a decade and 6 months. When the box office numbers came in, showing the film was a massive hit, Small was relieved but traumatized. He'd gambled everything and won, but the experience had nearly destroyed him. From that point forward, he focused on safer projects, smaller budgets, less ambitious stories. He produced dozens of films over the next 3 decades, many of them profitable, but none of them came close to matching the scope or impact of The Last of the Mohicans. In interviews later in life, journalists would ask if he regretted playing it safe after such a spectacular success. Small always said no. He said making that one film took years off his life, and he valued his health more than his legacy. But then he'd pause and admit that sometimes, late at night, he wondered what would have happened if he'd kept taking those kinds of risks, if he'd kept pushing boundaries, kept suffering for greatness instead of settling for competence. The Last of the Mohicans was his masterpiece and his cautionary tale, proof that you can achieve something extraordinary if you're willing to pay the price, but also proof that the price might be too high to pay twice. Number 19. The film was completely overshadowed at the box office by another frontier epic released the same year, Cecil B. DeMille's The Plainsman, starring Gary Cooper and Jean Arthur, opened just 2 months after The Last of the Mohicans with triple the budget, massive promotion, and the full weight of Paramount Pictures behind it. The Plainsman dominated theaters, grabbed all the headlines, and became the frontier film everyone remembered from 1936. Edward Small's movie, despite being a critical and commercial success, was treated like a footnote. It drove Small crazy. He'd worked harder, suffered more, and created something equally powerful. But DeMille had the studio machine and the star power. For years, The Last of the Mohicans was forgotten, dismissed as a minor adventure film from a minor producer. But then, something strange happened. As decades passed, The Plainsman faded from memory while The Last of the Mohicans kept finding new audiences. It played on television, got restored for home video, influenced later filmmakers. Michael Mann cited it as a major inspiration for his 1992 remake. Slowly, quietly, Small's film achieved something DeMille's never did. It became timeless, not because it had the biggest budget or the brightest stars, but because it had truth. Because suffering for art leaves a mark that outlasts publicity. Today, when people think of 1930s frontier films, they think of Small's version, not DeMille's. Sometimes the best revenge is longevity. Number 20. After The Last of the Mohicans wrapped, the cast and crew held a private screening in the mountains where they'd filmed. No executives, no press, just the people who'd survived it together. They built a makeshift screen between 2 trees, rigged a generator-powered projector, and watched under the stars. As the footage played, people cried, not from sadness, but recognition. They saw their exhaustion, their near breaking points, their refusal to quit. When it ended, silence. Then Randolph Scott stood and thanked everyone, the stunt performers who risked death, the crew who hauled equipment up mountains, the actors who pushed through pain. He said they'd created something none of them could have made alone. That night, they buried a time capsule at the mountain's base. Inside, call sheets, costumes, photos, letters about what it all meant. They swore to return in 25 years. Most never did. But the capsule remains somewhere in the Sierra Nevada, holding memories of the film that nearly killed them and made them legendary. Bonus fact: Bruce Cabot's portrayal of Magua was so convincing that he received death threats from viewers who believed he was actually a violent Native American warrior. Letters flooded the studio calling him a savage, demanding deportation or arrest. One letter threatened to shoot him on sight. The FBI stepped in, assigning Cabot security for months. The irony cut deep. Cabot was a white actor in makeup, playing a character written by a white author. Yet, audiences believed the fiction so completely, they wanted him punished for crimes that never happened. It revealed something dark about 1930s America, how eager people were to hate. Cabot later said the experience disgusted him, made him question taking the role. But it also proved cinema's dangerous power, how a performance could blur reality until audiences forgot where the character ended and the actor began. Years later, when asked about his most memorable role, Cabot never mentioned King Kong. He always talked about Magua, the character that was too real for his own good. Because sometimes great acting doesn't just move audiences, it exposes them.